one of the things that has been at the forefront of planning for our local communities has been how to use all this influx of money coming from the federal government and even from the state or the county to put forth projects in local communities and efforts and initiatives for the future. Using what is called American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA funds from the federal government. Some communities have already put that to use. In West Bloomfield, they've used some of those funds for public safety. For example, some new apparatus for the West Bloomfield fire department. That's part of what West Bloomfield used their ARPA funds for. They've also used them for some in partnership with Oakland County for water and sewer improvements. In Keagle Harbor, you've seen that in places like Baxter Morgan and Rose Sorter Parks in their gazebos and other facilities with improvements. But some communities really struggling to decide what we're going to use those funds for, and when we make those decisions, how to make that happen before these funds run out. Joining us now to talk about those struggles and how communities are grappling with this influx of funding from the federal government is Dr. Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration. Dr. Greiner, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's great to be here, Tyler. It's great to see you and Dave working together this morning.
Yeah, great to have you on. First time we've had you on this new version of the Splash Live. If you've been with us for a while watching at home, Dr. Greiner always been on with me every Friday on the MegaCast for the last couple of years, and glad to have you on to talk about this because you have an interesting perspective on this. Having worked for a number of years in municipal government, this is a unique situation for these municipalities, getting this influx of cash coming from the federal government. They only have a certain amount of time to use it on and only can use it on a certain subset of projects.
Yeah, this is kind of a unique problem to have, and it's something that, frankly, most municipal government officials would love to have this problem. You know, usually we're dealing with the problem of having too little money rather than too much money. You know, when this was originally passed by the federal government, basically the concern was that as a result of the COVID recession, that there'd be this drop in revenues coming into local governments. And so there would be this gap that would last for a certain amount of time. And they didn't know how long this amount of time would last. So they kind of left a large amount of funds available there to cover this gap. Well, as we know, things bounced back from the COVID recession much faster than I think anybody expected. So as a result, they've got good revenues coming in just based upon their typical tax revenues and licensing fees and that type of thing. But at the same time, they still have these excess funds left over from this ARPA grant. Now, you have to remember also, these ARPA funds are a one-time infusion of funds. So the communities, even though they are limited in the types of things that they can spend their money on, they're further limited by the fact that they don't want to commit themselves to having to spend funds into the future that they don't have coming in anymore. So, for example, they don't want to say add a bunch of police officers, which they could afford this year because of these funds being there, but then that will obligate them to make these payments to these police officers going into the future. So at the same time, they have to kind of balance this concern over the fact that, number one, they have all these funds, which is great, but number two, they don't want to kind of obligate themselves to some kind of cost that's going to go into the future when they won't necessarily have those funds coming in.
And that's where that balance comes into play, because in some of these cases, this money can go towards certain initiatives in your community that may be of dire need right now, or something that these communities have wanted to put in place to help residents with a number of different issues for a number of years. But at the same time, at what point do you then rip the carpet out from under them with this funding and go back to this sense of normality? And so from a municipal government standpoint, in your experience as you and other leaders and other workers in that particular municipality, whether it's a city or a township or a village, how do you go about balancing the immediate needs of the community with the future financial situation of that particular municipality?
Yeah, that's always a big challenge. And I can tell you, just from a political standpoint, too, it's very difficult for local leaders to kind of balance this, because on the one hand, you do have these demands on them. Hey, spend this money now. We've got all these funds. We've got all these needs. And there are always way more needs than you have money for. You know, even now, there are more needs than they have money for, even when they have the surplus. As a result of that, there's this urge for them to kind of spend the money with many of them thinking, hey, you know, I might not be in office once the kind of the chickens come home to roost, and we have to continue paying this when we don't have the funds available. So it's a real challenge to kind of make sure that they're responsible. Fortunately, most local leaders are very responsible and take very seriously the responsibility that they're given by the taxpayers to make sure that the funds are spent wisely. So one thing that they will probably focus in on a lot would be capital expenditures, things like buildings that need to be done, and especially where you're talking about like repairs and that type of thing, that where you might have deferred maintenance for years when you didn't have the funds for it. You know, new construction can be financed quite cheaply by municipal government because they can issue municipal bonds, which in Wall Street they love to buy, and because of the fact that they're tax-free, they can get a very, very low interest rate on them relative to other kinds of borrowing. So financing new municipal projects tends to be very cheap, but things like repairs to those things, repairs to roads, that type of thing, they might not be the types of things that you can essentially finance over long periods of time. And so as a result, with this big infusion of money, that might appear to be an opportunity to do that there. Now, the problem that they're running into as they're trying to do that, though, is that there's kind of built up this whole infrastructure of suppliers and contractors who are able to do the kind of work that they need. Like, you know, if somebody came to me and said, hey, can you repair these roads? Even though I worked in municipal government, I wouldn't know how to do it. You know, I'm not trained how to do it. And so you have these people who are experts in being able to repair these roads or to be able to repair sewer lines and that type of thing. And and there are only a limited number of those people. And so as a result of that, now what we're seeing is that there's a shortage of people who are able to do the kind of projects then that municipal governments want to engage in. And that's been part of the holdup here.
And like everything else, it seems lately, inflation also playing a big role in this. The supply chain, you already sort of mentioned that, also playing a big role in that. Many municipal leaders are struggling with, they had dedicated these funds, or they had proposed to dedicate these funds they're getting through the American Rescue Plan Act to go toward this project or that project or these projects. And now they're getting to the point where they're ready to put those in motion. They've got contractors lined up. They're negotiating contracts with them, and costs of supplies have gone up due to scarcity, or cost of labor has gone up. And now they got to make those adjustments. So when you get to that point, and given where we're at in the economy right now, would you imagine that maybe being a bit of a relief going forward for these municipalities before these funds run out? Or would you imagine that on the other side of that, it's more likely they're going to have to go back to the drawing board in some sense and decide which parts of these projects are going to happen and which other ones are unfortunately going to fall through?
Yeah, I do think, unfortunately, they're going to have to go back to the drawing board on a lot of this because the costs are just going to be higher. You know, I remember back when I worked in municipal government, China was actually still building their Three Gorges Dam, which was one of the largest government projects in the world, one of the largest infrastructure projects in the world. And you might think, well, what does China building a dam have to do with us over here in Michigan? Well, as it turns out, they were using so much concrete for it that there was actually a global shortage of concrete that then drove up the prices here in Michigan and made it harder for us to build roads. So as a result of that, we had to kind of prioritize certain projects over others. Now, the bigger issue that we're dealing with, though, isn't so much the supplies, although there is a little bit of that, as you point out, but it's the limitations on the labor. You know, again, you have people who are skilled in being able to do these things. You know, if you just went to many workers out there and said, hey, you know, we want to clean up this park, you know, anybody would be able to do that. On the other hand, though, if you go to them and say, hey, we want to dig up this road and we want to repair the sewer lines that are underneath it, and the water lines at the wastewater treatment plant are all old and need to be replaced. If you come to them and say that type of thing, well, suddenly you need to have people who are expert in being able to do that, and it takes time to train them. And the concern is, by the time these people are trained, the money will have already run out. So there is this competition then for these to access these different suppliers. And what it's doing is driving up the cost of them, which then makes it so obviously the funds are going to go shorter distances. I mean, it's really, as you point out, very similar to the same situation that we saw that kind of started inflation back as we came roaring out of that COVID recession in the first place.
Yeah, cost of supplies, cost of labor, not only affecting municipalities, but projects for homeowners and for car suppliers and so on all throughout the country. Dr. Greiner, thank you as always for your insight and for giving us also a look into the municipal government side of this, because this is an issue that's going to be affecting a wide range of communities in our local area. Appreciate your time.
Great to be here.